Competition is fierce in the used car arena, so how can you ensure that your pre-owned inventory stands above the rest? Success starts with the quality of your leads. Auto Trader for Independents offers products that help drive high-quality leads for independent dealers like you.
Welcome to Used Car News Podcast. Used Car News is your top source for fast and reliable news that car dealers can rely on for this evolving industry. Here are this month's top stories. Amelung bring in that new generation. FTC tests legal theory in suit against large dealer group. Dealer sales manager plead guilty to money laundering. But first, we sit down with Kirsten Van Busch, the Director of Product Marketing at Experian.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Used Car News Podcast. My name is Jeffrey Bellant. I'm Managing Editor over at Used Car News. And today we got a kind of a special podcast. We have Kirsten Van Busch. She is a Director of Product Marketing over at Experian. Did I get that title right, Kirsten?
You did.
Oh, great. Welcome. I appreciate you being here.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Jeffrey. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Yeah, we love the information we get from Experian, whether it's the automotive finance reports we get with Melinda Zabriskie, and now this is a new one with you. We keep hearing about it. We know that we have a market now where we have more generations than ever being involved in it because people are living longer. This special report of yours, could you tell us what it's called and what you guys were looking at?
Yes, absolutely. So every quarter we put out a report, the Automotive Consumer Trends and Analysis Report. And typically we focus on a specific vehicle segment. However, we wanted to share with the market some overall generational insights. So this is a special report that we published that focuses solely on generational insights for the overall automotive market.
I saw that you did both new and used, so obviously we'll touch on a little bit on both of them, whatever you'd like, but I'd start off with the used. Now, just folks for listening, I know it's going to be a little difficult because you don't have your charts in front of you, but at the end, Chris will probably give you some information about how you can kind of access this type of information. On page 6 of the chart, it talks about automotive loan, average automotive loan amount by generation. Do these total loan amounts by generation correlate to anything specific? I mean, is it earning power or some other factor? And before you answer that, could you let people know what generations you were looking at, and what the year break is?
Yeah, absolutely. Why don't I start with that from just a definition perspective?
Thank you.
Absolutely. So from a generational breakout, we have identified Gen Z. Now we are defining Gen Z as people born between 1996 and 2015. So their current age would be 9 to 28. Now you might be thinking 9, well, they're not buying vehicles. You're right. So keep in mind for the Gen Z analysis, the insights are only for buyers over the age of 18.
Excellent. That's great. That helps.
And then millennials are defined as those born between 1981 and 1995. So their current age would be 29 to 43. Gen X are individuals born between 1965 and 1980. Their current age.
Got in there. I just got in there. Yeah.
Just snuck in, huh?
Yeah.
Their current age being 44 to 59. And then we have boomers, so baby boomers, born between 1946 and 1964. Their current age being 60 to 78 years old. And then last but not least, for this analysis, we have the silent generation. And those individuals were born between 1928 and 1945, their current age being 79 to 96 years old.
Okay. Yeah, that was one I hadn't heard of, the silent generation. That's good. So now on page 6, this is good then. That helps me explain the millennial part of it. What does this tell us, the average automotive loan amount by generation? What did you learn? What jumped out at you?
Yeah, I think this really just provides some initial introductory insight. So as we're looking at this, I mean, there's a lot of different things going into the automotive loan amount, right? I mean, what is the price of the vehicle being first and foremost? What is the budget that somebody has to be able to purchase a vehicle? Mm-hmm. But if we look at this from Gen Z to Millennial to Gen X to boomer to silent, it's a little bit of a bell curve, right? Where Gen Z having the lowest average automotive loan amount, increasing to millennials, increasing still to Gen X, decreasing a little bit with boomers, and further decreasing with the silent generation. So certainly I think that tells a story about the buyer and their purchase interest and kind of the point in life that they are at.
Yeah, so the highest amount was 32,000, almost 33,000 Gen X, almost 32,000 for millennials, and just under 31 for boomers, and then the other two were under 30,000.
That is correct, yes. And that, as you said before, is for the overall average loan amount for the last 12 months. So it is for new and used retail purchases.
Now, did those numbers kind of correlate with the next chart? I talked about average monthly payment by generation. Those look kind of similar. Is that the way you saw it?
Yeah, so from a visual perspective for the audience here, if they don't have the chart in front of them, again, it's kind of a bell curve a little bit, right? Where the Gen Z generation has the lowest average monthly payment for both leases as well as loans, increasing for millennials, increasing for Gen X, and then decreasing for boomers and for silent. So just as a frame of reference for everybody on the line here, Gen X, the average monthly payment for leases is $650.04. And the average loan amount monthly payment was $626.91. And that, again, is for the last 12 months, new and used retail purchases.
Okay, great. Yeah. And then everything else is a little bit lower. The millennials is a tad lower, boomers are a little bit lower. And then, of course, Gen Z and silent brought up the rear on those.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the page 30 jumped out at me. It talked about the 5-year generational trend for used retail registration. So these are people buying used cars, correct?
On page 30, that is correct, sir.
Okay. And what does that chart tell you? Because it looked like we have millennials a little higher, Gen X actually a little lower than millennials, and then there's a big drop off.
Yeah. So as you said, this is looking at the 5-year generational trend for used retail registrations. Now, over time, the silent generation, their percentage has decreased.
Of course,
we would expect that, right? I mean, as that population ages. On the reverse, the percentages for Gen Z have significantly increased, which again, as we would expect as that population ages and becomes of buying age. But I think the most interesting piece on this is the difference from boomers. So boomers had 19% market share for used retail registrations. So 19.9 being the exact amount. Now, comparing that to Gen X, where Gen X has 31.1%, and millennials having 31.4%. So they're just neck and neck. And those two generations then, but there's such a big gap between those 31 numbers and that 19% for boomers. So boomers certainly over-indexing for new purchases.
Is that what the difference is, right?
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
Interesting, yeah, because that jumped out at me too, because that was, again, odd from what we were seeing. What about other things on the used side that you've seen? First of all, and I didn't ask you this beforehand, and maybe you guys didn't look at this, but I was wondering, did you look at the idea of like a Generation Z, where I see my nephews who are in that area, and some of them didn't get their licenses real quick, or some gals don't get their license quick, like maybe I did when I was that age. Did you guys notice anything like that, or is that something you didn't look at?
Well, we didn't further segment the generation by age. Now, I mean, certainly we would have the ability to look into additional detail by age, but we just grouped it as a whole for the entire generation.
That's cool.
At this
That's
point.
Cool. That's cool. And what else? What are some of the things that popped out at you at this study? Now, did you have like assumptions going into it?
Yeah, I mean, certainly we had some hypotheses going into this. And the interesting thing with data, Jeffrey, that I love is even if it proves out what you initially thought, it's so helpful to have the data backing your assumptions.
Right.
So you're really, truly making data-driven decisions and not just basing it off of assumptions or conjecture. So some of the expectations, like silent percentages, have decreased. Mm-hmm. Gen Z percentages have increased. That's obviously a really simple example, but yeah, those held true. Now, there were other things, though, that I was surprised by. We just mentioned one where boomers having a much lower market share percentage for used retail registrations compared to millennials and Gen X. So that was certainly something that was interesting, and a number of different findings on the new side as well. I know we're focusing on used conversation today, but there were a number of things that jumped out and surprised me.
Yeah, I want to go to those. I do want to ask one question though on the used. See, I think this is one of the things that can help some of our readers, a lot of whom are independent dealers, that they can look at their marketing. And of course, I know it all depends on where your market is, what the people and the demographics are in your area. But it is interesting for example, that boomer figure to say, okay, if I'm not in a boomer area, boy, that makes sense that maybe I shouldn't be heavily focused on that in my marketing or do something to not go after them because that might not be my target. Does that sound right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And let's say, certainly electric vehicles are in the headlines regularly these days. And we make assumptions that electric vehicles are oftentimes purchased by a younger demographic. Well, if we look at the chart information on slide 34, we looked at used retail registrations by generation and fuel type. And for example, millennials overall are purchasing 31% of used retail vehicles. However, when we look at that 31% for millennials, they have a much higher percentage of activity for electric vehicles.
Yeah, wow.
So that's where I say, a group may be over-indexing in that case, or boomers, for example, are under-indexing for used electric vehicles, as are Gen Z. And that might be something that, you wouldn't necessarily assume going in. It is conjecture on my part, but I would say from a Gen Z perspective, that may have more to do with the purchase price of those vehicles than the interest in the fuel type. But again, it really helps for your marketing efforts to have these insights to be able to make choices for how you can advocate for the inventory on your lot and for your prospects.
Yeah, I was going to say that it is interesting because you'd think, okay, younger people would be more inclined to go after EVs, but maybe with prices and interest rates and things like that you might think the older generations might be able to have the affordability. So it is interesting that you still see the millennials with that high percentage of it. And I guess I'm not surprised because of the interest that the boomers, I guess, I'm just surprised that the millennials would be higher than the Gen Xs. I would think they would have a little bit more spending power, but that's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Where, the Gen X is index right around the same as their overall rate. So meaning that, the percentage of electrics they're buying is about the same percentage as used vehicles they're buying as a whole, where millennials are buying more EVs from a percentage perspective. So very interesting.
Competition is fierce in the used car arena, so how can you ensure that your pre-owned inventory stands above the rest? Success starts with the quality of your leads. AutoTrader for Independents offers products that help drive high-quality leads for independent dealers like you.
So what are some of the things on the new car side that jumped out at you that you really was interested in?
Yeah. Now, a couple things on the new car side. So we looked at overall activity. Of course, we looked at 5-year trends. We talked about boomers having a lower index for used retail vehicles. Well, on the flip side, they have a higher percentage of activity for new retail vehicles. So that certainly held true.
Okay.
Now, we also looked at information by class, so luxury, non-luxury, by vehicle segment, and by fuel type. And one other thing, just since we were talking about electric vehicles, to call out that I thought was really interesting is we hear all the time in the headlines that the EV market has slowed. And I'm not disagreeing with that statement as a whole. Now, with that being said, when we look at the data for the year 2024, when we did this analysis, we had information through the end of May. And millennials and Gen Z, their percentage of market share for new electric vehicle registrations continued to increase. So it was still higher than it was for 2023 calendar year as a whole. Now, Gen X and boomers decreased. Not a lot necessarily, but from a percentage perspective, they went down. So again, it's not the market as a whole, but really digging into the data and understanding where those nuances are. So then you can plan and take action accordingly.
So when you say it's not the market, it's the specific people or segments that are the thing to look at.
Yes, absolutely.
And for you guys, when you put this study together, and I'll get back to your regular other things as well, but when you put this study together, what was the purpose in this one, in this generational thing? Was it just a matter of you had this data on all these generations and wanted to see what it said?
Yeah, so that was part of it. I mean, where, of course, I love digging into the data details, but how can we apply the insights is so important. And right now, franchise independent dealers are having to do more marketing than they have necessarily had to do in the last several years, where we're not in that order taking environment anymore. So I would always recommend that somebody dig into their own data and understand their customers and their prospects. But if that's not a luxury available to someone, these are some really great broad generalities that can still provide some insight to someone, where if I don't have maybe all the detail about my own data analysis, but I know a lot of my consumers are millennials. Okay, how might I market to them? These are some overall findings that I could certainly apply for my marketing strategy and for my individual campaigns.
That's excellent. And what is interesting is both on the new and used car side, when you have these 5-year generational trends, you get, okay, those aren't going to be, the past is not necessarily the future, but if you see a trend going a certain way, EVs is a really good example, but then it kind of helps you anticipate what you should do or where things are going.
Absolutely.
And now the other thing, anything else on the news side? I know you looked at audience models, built on different factors and looking at information about what the characteristics of certain cars were. Was there anything else that jumped out at you? Maybe even something that you didn't expect?
All right, something that I didn't expect. So one thing that we looked at with the new analysis was we looked at the top 10 market share by model for each generation. And this is where getting into the data details, I think really matters, because if you looked at just kind of the headlines alone, the top model for Gen Z, for example, is the Honda Civic. Okay. Now, the top model for millennials is also the Honda Civic. However, while those statements are 100% accurate, the percentage of registrations for Gen Z, the Honda Civic represents almost 4%, 3.9. Now, the next closest is the Toyota RAV4 at 3%. Now, when we look at millennials, though, again, it's the Civic and the RAV4, but they are neck and neck. 2.6 and 2.6, less than 0.2 of a decimal point difference, where I think it just starts to really illustrate that story of what vehicles are people looking at, what they're interested in, what their purchasing power certainly changes as the population ages. And that's why it's so important to look at the overall picture, but the detailed numbers as well.
Yeah, I saw the Gen X where it had their number one was Ford F-150, and the second one was a Silverado 1500, which I thought that was kind of interesting. I know that had to be work related or whatnot, because that's a bigger truck. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, when we look at boomers, for example, their number one was the Honda CRV. So again, a little bit larger, but not quite as large as we were looking at for the Gen X top vehicle.
That is interesting. For you, what does this do for you in terms of thinking, okay, I've got this kind of information. You're looking at it quarterly, you said, correct?
Overall, yes.
And so for you, as you look ahead, is there something that you're seeing that maybe you haven't looked at until now, and you're thinking we've got to keep a closer eye on this type of information? Or do you see this kind of continuing in the same way?
Yeah, no, that does make sense. So certainly from a trend perspective, I am very curious to see what happens in the EV space, right? Do those sales slow? Do they continue to increase? Is it at a smaller percentage? What happens there? That will be very interesting. And then also as the Gen Z category ages and they get older, what is their purchase interest? And what vehicles are they purchasing as they purchase a larger volume of vehicles? So we'll be watching both of those very closely.
Yeah, this is great. This is something we've interviewed Melinda Zabriskie from the automotive finance side a few times. So this is definitely something I'd love to revisit with you, maybe towards the back end of the year or maybe early next year, if that's okay, Kirsten.
Yeah, absolutely. This was the first time we published this specific special report, and I really would like to make it an annual event so we can see how it changes and grows and expands and, where there are differences over time.
Now, is this available to anyone? I mean, could dealers or, some of our readers get a copy of this report?
Yes, absolutely. So this is available right now to everyone. And it is, I also want to make sure everybody knows, it is absolutely free to everyone.
Oh, we like that.
Yes, it is. So we have a blog post that provides a nice little summary about this report. And then it provides a link to the full report that someone can download to review all the details that we discussed today and more. And I'm happy to provide that link.
Yeah, I did that was myself. It was pretty great. So it's a special report, Automotive Consumer Trends and Analysis. And then the special report part of it is generational insights. So definitely. So is it like, would you go to Experian.com, that type of thing?
Yeah, so it is available under Experian Automotive. We have a blog section, and if you would be so kind as to include that link to your audience, they can get right to it. Otherwise, I can read off the URL to them, but it is www.
If we go to Experian Automotive blog, I'm sure they can find it.
Yep, absolutely.
That's awesome. I appreciate it. Kirsten von Busch, again, Director of Product Marketing for over Experian for Automotive Consumer Trends and Analysis. This is really good, and definitely will maybe do something in the future in the print edition too, kind of help out with the chart reading and everything. But boy, I really appreciate you looking at these things. Obviously, generational stuff is a bigger issue now because we have so many people in the marketplace. So I do appreciate you taking time with us here on Used Car News Podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Have a great day.
Competition is fierce in the used car arena, so how can you ensure that your pre-owned inventory stands above the rest? Success starts with the quality of your leads. AutoTrader for Independents offers products that help drive high-quality leads for independent dealers like you.
Craig Amelung's career in the auto auction industry began in 1993 when he answered a newspaper ad for a credit collections manager at the Baltimore-Washington Auto Exchange. Initially hesitant, he was captivated by the fast-paced auction environment and quickly advanced to roles like office manager and fleet lease manager. Amelung joined Manheim in 2002, eventually overseeing multiple market centers. His involvement with the National Auto Auction Association, or NAAA, grew through active participation in committees and legislative engagement, eventually leading to his role on the board. As the incoming president of the NAAA, Amelung aims to enhance member participation, improve administrative practices, and engage a new generation in the industry, building on the work of his predecessors to leave the association better than he found it. Last month, the FTC filed an administrative complaint against a large dealer group including its parent company and 3 Texas dealerships, for alleged credit discrimination and unauthorized charges for voluntary protection products. The FTC claims these dealerships imposed hidden fees on customers, particularly targeting Black and Latino customers, without their express consent. The case will be reviewed by an administrative law judge with a hearing set for April 2025. If the FTC finds violations, it may issue a cease and desist order, which the dealerships can appeal. This case offers a rare chance for transparency in FTC procedures, as most similar disputes are settled out of court. The outcome could have significant implications for how dealerships handle credit terms and customer consent in future transactions. Charlotte car dealership owner John Harvey Martin and sales manager Vincent Emmanuel Jefferson Jr. have pleaded guilty to money laundering conspiracy charges. The scheme involves selling around 20 luxury vehicles to an individual known as GD, whom the defendants knew or should have known was a drug dealer. They accepted over $520,000 in cash from GD, using straw purchasers to hide GD's identity and the illicit source of funds. Martin also used funds from these transactions for property renovations and to buy the Scorpio nightclub, concealing GD's ownership interest. Both Martin and Jefferson face up to 20 years in prison after being released on bond. Thanks for listening to Used Car News Podcast. Each month, we'll bring you fast and reliable news that car dealers can rely on for this evolving industry. For a free subscription of Used Car News, please go to usedcarnews.com. This podcast is a production of BG Ad Group. Make sure to share us on social media and like and follow wherever you get your podcasts.
Competition is fierce in the used car arena, so how can you ensure that your pre-owned inventory stands above the rest? Success starts with the quality of your leads. AutoTrader for Independents offers products that help drive high-quality leads for independent dealers like you.